In his Oval Office speech, President Obama said American Muslims were going to have to work harder to watch their own community for signs of dangerous radicalization. Then, the leading Republican candidate for president raised the ante way higher, proposing a ban on Muslims entering the United States for a time, until the U.S. gets a better handle on who means to do harm. Politicians jeered the billionaire's comments, but his audience cheered. What do American Muslims make of the suggestions they haven't done enough to root out violent extremists, or the suggestion to bar the world's Muslims? Slamming the door? It's the Inside Story. Welcome to Inside Story. I'm Ray Suarez. Sunday night brought this assertion from the American president, that Muslims cannot deny, quote, the fact that an extremist ideology has spread within some Muslim communities. This is a real problem that Muslims must confront without excuse. Normally, that kind of talk would immediately be met with a retort that Muslims are not the problem, that many people around the world have worked hard to prevent violent extremism in the name of Islam. But these aren't normal days. Right after the killing of Americans attending a holiday luncheon in San Bernardino, California, in the last several days, it's become commonplace to hear that there is a problem inside Islam, among Muslims, and the news from a California crime scene is deepening that conviction.
But it is clear that the two of them had gone down the dark path of radicalization, embracing a perverted interpretation of Islam that calls for war against America and the West.
President Obama, speaking to the American people from the Oval Office Sunday night, calling for calm in the wake of the San Bernardino shooting rampage, carried out by a Muslim couple appear to have been supporters of ISIL.
We cannot turn against one another by letting this fight be defined as a war between America and Islam.
The president's address lacked any new details on U.S. strategy for fighting ISIL in Iraq and Syria, but Mr. Obama did call for a more proactive approach from the Muslim community here at home.
Extremist ideology has spread within some Muslim communities. There's a real problem that Muslims must confront without excuse. Muslim leaders here and around the globe have to continue working with us to decisively and unequivocally reject the hateful ideology that groups like ISIL and al-Qaeda promote.
Less than 24 hours after the president's speech, the man who theoretically could be America's next chief executive said this.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on.
Controversial comments followed by thunderous applause.
You have no choice.
What's becoming a common theme for the tough-talking real estate tycoon.
We can be politically correct and we can be stupid, but it's going to get worse and worse. Until we are able to determine and understand this problem and the dangerous threat it poses, our country cannot be the victim of horrendous attacks by people that believe only in jihad.
Trump hasn't minced words on the campaign trail, but his latest comments have sparked near-universal opposition from both sides of the aisle in Washington and rights groups around the globe.
Donald Trump sounds more like a leader of a lynch mob than a great nation like ours.
What was proposed yesterday is not what this is for, and more importantly, it's not what this country stands for.
Donald Trump is standing on the platform of hate, and I'm sorry to say hate that the Republican Party has built for him.
Most Republicans were quick to criticize President Obama's speech. Many were even quicker in slamming Trump's suggestion. But with a growing base of voter support, even some of Trump's biggest rivals on the road to the White House are following his lead.
I commend Donald Trump for standing up and focusing America's attention on the need to secure our borders.
Slamming the door, this time on the program, perhaps the latest salvo from Donald Trump has set off a stampede to the microphones. has it also raised the bar for what's thinkable, what's sayable out loud in American politics? And should American Muslims be worried when they hear these words from Trump that make the president's call for self-policing inside a world religion seem tame by comparison? Joining me for that conversation, M. Zuhdi Jasser is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. Haroon Moghal is the senior correspondent for Religion Dispatches, an online publication, and Saba Ahmed is the founder of the Republican Muslim Coalition. Zuhdi Jasser, what did you make of what you heard from both the president and the leading Republican candidate?
Well, I think first, thanks for having me, Ray. You know, the president, I think, made some progress. He started to talk about ideology. I do think he's giving a cognitive dissonance where he says, you know, it's not Islam, but yet says Muslims need to own this. So ultimately, I will say that we've been too focused on the operational aspect of radicalization, even though radicalization takes years. So we've defined radicalization as when they start to get weapons, when they vanish, when they become violent jihadis, when in fact jihadization takes years of separatism. And unfortunately, we still as a country have not addressed the Islamo-patriotism, not only of countries like ISIS, but the Muslim Brotherhood, the Khomeinists of Iran, the Wahhabis. So ultimately, this ism that can only be treated with the identity of American patriotism for freedom of religion, of our liberty in America. That's why both parties are really, right now, with those in the lead of the polls, headed in the wrong direction. Hillary wants to make us into a monolith, that Islam is all peaceful. It doesn't bring reformers like myself to the table. Trump is doing the same thing, lumping all Muslims as one, basically setting aside and surrendering to the narrative of ISIS, which is also very much a failure in strategy.
Saba Ahmed, has this shown an uncomfortable light on a community that comes from 36 different countries, speaks many home languages, including native English, because many of these people are native born? Are we talking about a community, because we don't know how else to describe what is actually a very diverse group of people?
Exactly. We have over 1 billion Muslims in the world. Not all of them are radicals. We have a serious problem in this country with national security challenges being exploited by certain Republican candidates. And you know, it's sad to see the fear mongering that's going on. He's playing on the fears of Americans. Right after a San Bernardino tragedy, he's trying to come up with ridiculous, unconstitutional policies which are going to hurt most Americans. If he, under his plan, if I travel outside the U.S., I can't come back in the country because I'm a Muslim. So.
But let's stipulate, for the purposes of this conversation, Zuhdi just mentioned that leaders are letting us down. You've mentioned that leaders are letting us down. Let's forget leaders for a moment and talk about the people who were in that audience cheering when Donald Trump said what he said.
Exactly. It was South Carolina audience. There's hardly any Muslims in South Carolina. We do have few, because I was just there in when the Charleston, South Carolina shootings happened. We went there to pay our respects to the victims and families. But obviously, he's playing on people who are not very well versed on foreign policies, and especially in South Carolina. In North Carolina earlier this year, we had 3 young Muslim students who were shot to death because of this hateful ideology, hateful bigotry against Muslim Americans. So that's why people living there couldn't stand a Muslim neighbor who were very peaceful young students, but he decided to shoot them down. And similarly, what happened last week in San Bernardino with one of them was born and raised here, becoming radicalized and then going against his own co-workers. It's absolutely horrifying to think that that's something that could happen. Both stem from extremism. One was Christian, one was Muslim. But we need to target the extremist elements of all different faiths.
Haroon Moghal, we are dealing with a situation where even people of goodwill who are watching this all play out in Paris, in London, on the tube just in the past couple of days, in San Bernardino, think it sounds like a pretty similar set of MOs from one source, even if they're smart enough, sophisticated enough to say, oh, I realize it's not all Muslims, but it seems like a lot of the ones who are doing it are Muslims. How do you start in a way that makes sense?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I think the way to answer that is to go to how we try to explain what's happening. And there are different narratives. There is the Islam is peace narrative. There is Islam is violence, and only Islam produces violence in the world. There's the clash of civilizations. What we have, unfortunately, instead is years and years of bad ideas and failed policies that have led us to this juncture. Some of the fault obviously lies in Muslim communities and countries, and some of the fault lies in Western communities and countries. We talk about radicalization of Muslims. The Republican Party has been self-radicalizing for years. The difference between the American Muslim community and the Republican Party is the Republican Party has been taken over by the extremist. We are not yet beholden to any Donald Trumps or Ben Carsons. We do not have mainstream American Muslim leaders who openly call for killing the families of terrorists, which is a war crime and actually, incidentally, is the definition of terrorism. Now, that doesn't mean that Islamic extremism is not a serious problem and a danger that needs to be confronted on many levels. But the unfortunate reality is we've ended up in this position because we've failed to talk to each other, we've failed to understand each other, and we've pursued policies without considering the consequences of them. And that does mean, as you said, responsibilities for Muslim communities. It also means responsibilities at the political level. And unfortunately, in President Obama's speech, we didn't really hear any sense of what he wants to do about this beyond telling us what he's already doing, which I think for most people clearly is not working.
What's the most effective way forward, and the one that lines up with America's most cherished ideals? Stay with us. It's Inside Story. You're watching Inside Story. I'm Ray Suarez. FBI investigators now say the California couple accused of the San Bernardino shootings, Syed Rizwan Farouk and Tashfeen Malik, had long been radicalized, honing their weapon skills up until just a few days before the attack, which killed many of Farouk's co-workers. Complicating the picture even further, the FBI also says at the moment there's no evidence the attack was coordinated from outside the United States. That turns attention and suspicion on the millions of Muslims already living in the United States in a way that can't be comfortable, empowering those ready to insist there's a growing enemy within. The door today on the program, Harun Mogul, Zudi Jasser, and Saba Ahmed are still with me. Saba, it's tempting to think that there's an easy answer. So, in one way, Donald Trump's answer seems easy. And there may be, for some Americans, some satisfaction in that. But it is concerning, isn't it? That there is no outside coordination, that this couple sort of got this notion and pulled this off.
We've had 350 plus mass shootings in the United States this year alone. So not every one of them was radicalized through Islam. We had a lot of lone wolf attacks all over. I'm from Oregon. I know in Oregon there was a shooting recently that took the lives of many people on college campus. And so we do have a gun culture. We do have serious issues. This doesn't happen in the UK because in UK you can't just go and get guns to commit crimes that easily. You know, we do have serious, I am a supporter of gun rights, but I think that it needs to be limited and it needs to be governed and monitored. We need to come up with other creative solutions because people who are becoming radicalized should not have access to rifles and shooting ranges and all of that. I think people should be looking into why there are so many mass shootings happening all over the U.S.
But Harun, how can we ever know who the next person is? It seems, on the face of it, to be impossible.
There's no absolute guarantee, and that's the unfortunate truth. There are things we can do. Saba is correct. Gun control is a step. Law enforcement, getting engaged, staying involved. But there's also things Muslim communities can do. Now, we can't necessarily reach people who are already farther down that road, but from now on, moving forward, we can change the way in which we develop leadership and train Muslims to become more engaged in their societies. And a big part of that is teaching young Muslims first about the importance of pluralism within the tradition and outside the tradition. And the second is to give them positive mechanisms to channel their grievances and fears. So let's say, a young man or woman is angry about the occupation of Palestine or what they're seeing in Syria. We're citizens of the United States. We have the ability to be politically involved. Those of us who are a little bit older, we need to model positive forms of engagement to say, look, you can have your concerns addressed and aired. You can move forward. And finally, to couple that with this kind of extremism isn't just morally vile. It's strategically completely self-defeating. What are these people actually accomplishing for the Muslim world? All they're doing is inviting more death, more destruction, and more damage. The people of Syria are no freer now than they were years ago. If anything, the situation is even more worse. And a major fault of that is that extremists have basically offered the only narratives. And we need to step up and say, yes, their narratives are wrong, but we have better narratives.
Guests, stay with us. When Donald Trump made his suggestion that closing the door to the U.S. for the world's Muslims might be justified by the current fights around the world, his audience cheered. What does that mean? Are Americans ready to give up long-cherished freedoms to keep their fears at bay? Slamming the door. Stay with us. It's Inside Story. To Inside Story, I'm Ray Suarez. The idea that a continent-sized country of more than 300 million people has been brought to its knees by two murderers shows the power, the logic behind terror attacks. They're meant to sow fear and suspicion, to push an opponent into lashing out. It's not clear how the suggestion to bar Muslims from the United States would really work, and it's clear it could never really happen. Every suggestion should have American Muslims thinking deeply about the lives they lead and their future in this country. Saba Ahmed, Zuhdi Jasser, and Haroon Mogul are still with me. Zuhdi Jasser, if you're a water quality engineer in Georgia, or a housewife in Chicago, or a small business owner in California, what do? You're busy doing your own life, doing the things that you do. So you say, well, this doesn't have anything directly to do with me, but I still feel called upon, in some sense, to explain something to somebody. What?
Well, I have to tell you, listening to my colleagues here, they're sort of exemplifying the fact that in some ways our community is in some deep denial. America has had a hunger for voices of Islam that are about reform, that own this, that want to take responsibility, and yet I'm hearing about gun control, I'm hearing about other shootings. The bottom line is Muslims might only be 1% of the population, but to that engineer, to that carpenter, to that lawyer, that physician, we just signed a Muslim Reform Movement declaration signed by 15 organizations that looked at ideas that separate us not only from the radicals, but the radicalization starts with large movements in Arabic, Harikat al-Islamiyya, these Islamic movements, Muslim Brotherhood, Khomeinists of Iran, the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia, hundreds of millions of people are moving movements that are separatists, that are anti-Western, that are anti-Semitic, and until we start countering that, our declaration said we believe against any violent jihad. We condemn all caliphate ideas and Islamic states. We believe in the equality of men and women. Muslims that don't believe in these principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and are willing to condemn Islamism are part of the problem.
Well, let me jump in there, because you signed this declaration, and it completely comports with American values. And next week, and the week after, and the week after that, will be Americans quoted in papers, you'll see them speaking on television, and they'll say, how come Muslims aren't speaking out against this kind of thing? I mean, does it make you a little crazy? You think you are. You think all these other signatories to this declaration are.
But we need to take that declaration to the mosque. We took it to the mosque on Mass Avenue, owned by the Saudis. We took it to the mosques in Northern Virginia, and they sort of ripped it off. They're looking at it. We want to hear from them that they're either on board or not. That's how you figure out in media, governments, who's working for solutions against that separatist ideology of Islamism and who's working for solutions. And the bottom line is that the radicalization, Muslims need to be, I would tell all of your viewers and those in our local communities, ask your local Muslim friends what they believe about this declaration of the Muslim Reform Movement. That's how you begin the conversation, because radicalization is not just those last moments when they start getting weapons and they become operationalized.
We have very little time left. Haroon and Saba, I want to hear final comments from you both on whether that's enough, or whether there's already a narrative in place that American Muslims, quote unquote, aren't doing enough, that's sort of impervious to the kind of things that Zuhdi is suggesting. Quickly, Haroon.
In the last 90 hours, a Muslim crowdfunding platform, LaunchGood, raised $90,000 for the victims of San Bernardino attack. I went on a program to Israel to study Judaism and Zionism with Israeli scholars. We were hosted by the largest North American Muslim gathering to discuss our experiences, the largest North American Muslim organization that exists. Obviously, this organization has not only endorsed that kind of debate and conversation, they've elected a female president twice, 2 terms. Zuhdi's talking about signing declarations. We don't need to sign declarations to know who we are and what we stand for. We are Americans. We believe in American values, and we don't need to write that down to know who we are.
Reform.
Saba Ahmed.
I agree with that. I think today's the first time I'm hearing about his declaration, but I would recommend mailing out a copy of it to all the 2,200 plus mosques around the United States.
Absolutely.
But I think more than that, we have a lot of work to do in terms of defending our communities, defending our religion in this country. It's under attack from all sides, and we do have serious national security challenges, and unless Muslim Americans step up and take responsibility, it will never end.
But even when you step up and take responsibility, there will be those Americans who say that you aren't doing anything. Is it frustrating?
It is very deeply frustrating. For me as a Republican, it's very frustrating. But I hope that, we have a whole year to go before the next presidential election. We will test this out. I think all of them will be well versed in Islam and Muslims by the time any of them get out of this race. So we are very positive and optimistic that American Muslims have a bright future ahead.
I want to thank my guests. Saba Ahmed is the founder of the Republican Muslim Coalition. Zuhdi Jasser is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. And Haroon Mogul is the senior correspondent for Religion Dispatches, an online publication. I'll be back in a moment with a final thought on responsibility, individual and collective. Stay with us.